Hello everyone, my name is Dmitry and today I am launching a small series of videos related to the Baltic countries and their path to freedom from communism. In this video I want to tell you about how Lithuania was the first to gain independence from the Soviet Union. If you are interested, you can subscribe to my channel. Thanks. In the mid-1980s, there was already a discussion on the Baltic states about sovereignty and assessments of the history of the 20th century. On the wave of interest in the national culture, a lot of music festivals and competitions were held, which were called the Singing Revolution. The biggest and most important was, of course, the Song and Dance Festival in Estonia, whose history at that time numbered about 120 years. But the nationalist-minded youth of other Baltic republics began to gather their events. In Lithuania, this was done by the Lithuania Club, which has held annual festivals since 1984, as well as the Experimental Youth Leisure Association Center and the Vilnius Youth Music Club, which held a rock march in 1988. People from all over the Baltic states came to such events, exchanged opinions, which of course only fueled nationalist sentiments and helped unite like-minded people into circles in independent societies. In Lithuania, supporters of sovereignty formed the movement Sąjūdis. They were mainly representatives of the creative intelligentsia, scientists of various specialties. On June 3, 1988, in the Great Hall of the Lithuanian Academy of Sciences, about 500 activists gathered to formalize the movement, adopt a common program and start publishing campaign materials. Sąjūdis was very popular. Already in October, 180,000 people, including representatives of the political elite, gathered at the First Constituent Congress. Initially, the activists did not advocate secession from the Union, but rather for broad political, economic and cultural autonomy, and even collaborated with the communists. But by the end of the year, the movement was increasingly inclined to the ideas of separatism, agitating for political reform of the entire USSR and sovereignty for all republics. Gradually, nationalist demonstrations throughout the Baltic states became widespread. The most famous action for independence at that time was called the Baltic Way. More than 2 million people joined the human chain stretching for almost 600 kilometers from the Long Herman Tower in Tallinn to the Gediminas Tower in Vilnius. The event was timed to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, according to which the Baltic states retreated into the zone of influence of the USSR during World War II. In Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania, this decision is considered the beginning of the Soviet occupation, although in reality Moscow did not have to seize the future Soviet republics by force. Nevertheless, then the Kremlin went to meet the Balts. Already on December 24, 1989, the Congress of People's Deputies of the USSR adopted a resolution recognizing the existence of a secret protocol to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and condemning it. This only fueled nationalist sentiments and strengthened the version of Soviet occupation. Thanks to this, Sąjūdis gained serious political weight. In February 1990, regular elections to the Supreme Council were held in Lithuania, at which Sąjūdis received 2/3 of the votes. And at the very first meeting on March 11, he adopted the Act on the Restoration of the Independent Lithuanian State. Thus, Lithuania became the first of the Union republics that decided to declare sovereignty. The Latvian SR followed the example of its neighbors on May 4th of the same year, the Estonian SR on May 8th. Such a step in the Union Center could no longer be ignored. On April 18, 1990, Moscow declared an economic blockade of Vilnius and stopped oil and gas supplies. Vilnius declared the incident an act of aggression and started developing anti-blockade measures. The blockade was remembered for one terrible event. Stanisław Žemaitis, a 52-year-old resident of the Lithuanian city of Mariupol, committed an act of self-immolation right in front of the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow. Thus he protested against economic repression against Vilnius. However, neither Lithuania nor the USSR changed their position after that. The Republican authorities surrendered only by the end of June and announced a 100-day moratorium on the Act of Independence. The blockade caused 11% of Lithuanians' GDP damage, but Vilnius and Moscow failed to reach an agreement. On January 13, 1991, soldiers of the Soviet garrison in Lithuania, paratroopers, soldiers of the Special Forces Alpha, and the Soviet militia with the support of heavy weapons took control of the television center and television tower in Vilnius. Mass street clash began, in which 15 civilians were killed, hundreds more were injured. Who exactly was the instigator of the riots is still unknown. Lithuania insists that what happened was an act of military aggression and an attempted occupation, and the military operation was planned by the supreme military leadership of the USSR. Several dozen citizens of Russia, Belarus and Ukraine, including former head of the USSR Defense Ministry Dmitry, were suspects in the criminal case of the events of that day. Most of them were convicted in absentia. Only 2 former servicemen are serving their sentences in Lithuania. But all the accused and convicted insist that they had no order to seize power. On the contrary, there was an order to act cautiously and maintain order. It is only known that in January 1991, the self-proclaimed Lithuanian National Salvation Committee announced the restoration of Soviet power in the Republic and called on Moscow for help. It is noteworthy that the composition of this organization, as well as official papers on its activities, have not been published. No one began to understand the story. On August 21st, a coup failed in Moscow. A month later, the State Council recognized the independence of Lithuania, as well as Latvia and Estonia.
In the rebellious Soviet Republic of Lithuania led to a confrontation in Moscow today between Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and his chief political rival Boris Yeltsin. At a stormy Kremlin meeting, Yeltsin condemned the military crackdown in Lithuania and warned that the use of military force there could provoke violence in other regions and unleash what Yeltsin called wide-scale civil conflict. Meanwhile, Gorbachev ordered a halt to the use of force in Lithuania today after 2 days of violent raids by Soviet troops that ended early this morning. ABC's Jim Laurie is in Vilnius.
Under the cover of darkness, Soviet troops continue to move against key installations. The military has now taken over the railroads, halting service in and out of the capital. Air service was stopped Thursday. Moscow moved tanks into the local police academy. Troops rounded up guns, arrested police cadets, while some were allowed to take their belongings and go home. Troops ransacked 3 other buildings, including a presidential guard barracks and a police station. For the second straight day, thousands of Lithuanians formed a defensive shield around key installations. Women doled out hot coffee at the television tower. Men kept warm by bonfires near the TV studios and the telephone exchange. Thousands more kept vigil at Lithuania's parliament. Moscow has been putting pressure on Lithuania for nearly a year now, but this crackdown is different both in its severity and in the Kremlin's effort through the state media to distort what is happening here. In its main news program, Soviet TV did not broadcast these scenes of Soviet paratroopers cracking down. The official media portrays pro-independent Lithuanians as a minority, instead promoting a small pro-Moscow Salvation Front, which seeks to take power from Lithuania's democratically elected government. Yesterday, pro-Moscow groups rallied. The Soviet media said 60,000 turned out. In fact, only 2,000 showed up, quickly outnumbered by supporters of independence. There was one hopeful sign today. Leaders of the nation's 15 republics agreed with Gorbachev to dispatch a delegation to Lithuania headed by the Armenian president. That could help defuse a crisis which these people fear could result in the end of their freedom. Jim Laurie, ABC News, Vilnius, Lithuania.